One aspect of our physical development looks at how our brain changes. If we think about prenatal development and the changes that the brain is undergoing, we can see that the brain is changing quite a bit from early conception all the way through birth. Remember, as we discussed in biopsychology, we start off first developing the hindbrain. From the hindbrain, we develop a midbrain and then finally the forebrain. The forebrain is the largest area, but the last area to fully develop. In fact, even our newborn here does not have a fully developed brain. It will continue to change throughout their lifetime, with that final region, the prefrontal cortex, potentially not fully maturing until sometime in our 20s. Some ways in which the brain changes we've already discussed. For example, the brain undergoes a process of developing new neurons. The birth of new neurons is called neurogenesis. Similar to this idea of neurogenesis is synaptogenesis, where we are developing new synaptic connections. Additionally, recall that our axons, when we are first born, lack that myelin sheath. We have to go through the process of myelination to build the myelin sheath around the axon. That myelin sheath has the consequence of making neural impulses more efficient when they are sent. So myelination can improve efficiency of neural communication. Another concept we have yet to talk about in this class is long-term potentiation. This is another way in which the brain will continue to change throughout our lifetime. We'll see a little bit more about long-term potentiation when we talk about memory. But for now, understand that when we rehearse a behavior or repeatedly practice it, the consequence in our brain is this process of long-term potentiation. It allows neural networks to communicate more efficiently. In other words, that idea of practice makes perfect may not be entirely accurate, but practice does make better, because practice contributes to long-term potentiation in the brain, making the brain more and more efficient every single time we practice a skill or study certain content, such as material from class. Finally, we have several processes here that speak to building up the brain, but we also need to recognize that sometimes there's just too much. We may go through a process of pruning in those scenarios. Pruning speaks to the removal of neural connections that are not being used. In fact, if we think about how much development is going on in the brain throughout our early childhood and adolescence, it's perhaps not surprising that we also are going through a high rate of pruning during childhood and adolescence. That process of pruning removes unused neural networks and has the effect of making the brain more efficient. In fact, in the adolescent brain, when I speak about the prefrontal cortex becoming more mature and fully developing, what's happening during adolescence is that we are going through a very high rate of pruning specifically in the prefrontal cortex. In other words, we are removing a lot of the clutter and unused neural networks, which allow the prefrontal cortex to be more efficient.